The word superstition today might make you think of something quaint, a black cat crossing your path, knocking on wood, avoiding the number 13. They are little habits, curious echoes of the past, more amusing than frightening. We smile at them, dismiss them, and move on. But in the Middle Ages, superstition was not a game. It was not an afterthought or a cultural quirk. It was a matter of survival. To the men and women of medieval Europe, the world was alive with invisible dangers. Every shadow might hide a demon. Every strange illness might be a curse. Every storm in the sky might be the work of the devil himself. This was a world where religion and fear were woven into every moment of daily life. A child's cry could be a warning of evil spirits. A crow perched on the roof might foretell death. To spill salt on the table was to invite disaster, unless you quickly threw a pinch over your left shoulder to blind the demon lurking there. To live in the Middle Ages was to live in a constant negotiation with unseen powers, and the price of forgetting, even for a moment, could be terrible misfortune. And so, peasants carried amulets sewn with scraps of bone. Merchants muttered charms before crossing a river. Mothers tied herbs above the cradles of their babies, desperate to protect them from the wandering spirits of the night. Every day was a battle fought not only against hunger, cold, and war, but against a universe full of invisible threats. Now, before we enter this strange and unsettling world, I invite you to make yourself comfortable. If you enjoy these quiet journeys into the darker corners of history, please consider leaving a like and subscribing, but only if you truly find peace in these stories. And as always, I would love to know from what part of the world are you listening tonight, and what time is it where you are? It is a quiet wonder to imagine our community scattered across the globe, bound together in this moment by the flickering lantern light of history. So dim the lights, settle into your bed or your chair, let the noise of the modern world fall away, and let us step back into a medieval village where the night is darker, the wind colder, and the fears that haunted the human heart are waiting for us still. To live in the Middle Ages was to live in a haunted world. Everywhere you looked, every sound you heard, every shadow that flickered on the wall at night carried a hidden meaning. For men and women of the medieval countryside, the air was never empty. It was thick with unseen presences. Angels and saints, demons and devils, wandering souls of the dead, spirits of the forest and the fields, they were thought to press in from all sides, invisible yet overwhelmingly close. When the sun dipped below the horizon, darkness did not simply mean night. It meant that the barriers between the human world and the world of spirits were thinner, fragile, and ready to break. The rustling of the wind in the rafters was not only wind. It might be a demon testing the walls of your house. The groaning of the timbers in the barn might not be age, but the cry of a ghost denied rest. Even the silence itself, heavy and oppressive, could be a sign that something was waiting just beyond the circle of firelight. For peasants who rose before dawn and worked until the stars returned, this sense of being surrounded by invisible forces was constant. You woke in the night and heard the howling of dogs in the distance. It was not simply dogs. It was the hounds of hell chasing a condemned soul through the sky. A sudden chill could mean that a spirit had passed by you, brushing your skin. A child's sudden fever was not an illness, but a punishment, perhaps for an unconfessed sin or the malice of a witch from the neighboring village. Life itself seemed balanced on a knife's edge. Fortune was fragile. Crops could fail. A fire could consume the house. a baby might sicken and die before its first birthday. And to those who lived then, these tragedies were never random. They were messages, punishments, warnings. Every misfortune pointed back to a world of spirits, unseen but never absent. Even the church, the one great authority, did not deny this. On the contrary, priests filled their sermons with warnings about the devil's snares, about angels who watch your every deed, about demons who waited at your deathbed to claim your soul. Heaven and hell were not abstract places far away. They pressed close. Heaven's light and hell's shadow mingled in every corner of daily life. This was a world without safety, a place where every barn, every riverbank, every patch of forest belonged not only to human beings, but to forces older, darker, and infinitely more powerful. A peasant might kneel before the altar in church on Sunday morning, but by nightfall he would hang a sprig of herbs above his door, or whisper a charm before bed, desperate for protection against the things that crept and lingered in the dark. And so, from birth to death, the medieval man and woman lived as though they were never alone. To them, the world was governed not by chance, nor even fully by human law, but by an invisible parliament of spirits, some merciful, many cruel, all impossibly close.
The medieval world was a world of messages. Every sound, every movement of the natural world was read as a sign. To ignore them was dangerous. To misunderstand them could be fatal. The flight of birds, for example, was never random. A crow perched on the roof of a house was an omen of death, a warning that someone within would not live long. A raven circling above the fields meant misfortune for the harvest. Even the humble owl, whose call breaks the silence of the night, was feared as a messenger of the grave. To hear its hoot outside your window was enough to send a shiver through the strongest heart. Animals of all kinds were believed to be tied to the unseen world. A black dog that appeared on the road at night might not be a dog at all, but a devil in disguise, a phantom that lured travelers to their doom. Cats, especially black ones, were said to serve witches and demons. A horse that stumbled without cause might be under the spell of an envious neighbor. Even insects could be signs. A sudden swarm of flies was not merely a nuisance, but a token of corruption and evil festering nearby. The heavens, too, spoke with terrifying clarity. An eclipse was never a natural event, but a curtain pulled back to reveal divine anger. The sun swallowed, the moon turned red. These were messages of war, plague, or the death of kings. A sudden storm, with thunder shaking the earth, was a battle between angels and demons, played out in the skies above. A shooting star, streaking across the night, was not a wonder, but a soul falling from heaven, lost to the fire below. Even the ordinary sounds of life were charged with meaning. A cock crowing at the wrong hour, a door creaking open without wind, the howling of a dog at midnight, each was interpreted as a warning. Dreams were especially powerful. A dream of teeth falling out meant a death in the family. A dream of water foretold tears. To dream of fire was to dream of the devil's hand reaching close. This constant search for signs filled the daily lives of peasants and nobles alike. A noblewoman might refuse to travel if she saw 3 magpies in the morning. A farmer might delay planting his field because of a strange pattern in the clouds. To modern eyes, this may seem like foolishness, but in their world, where safety was never guaranteed, signs and omens offered something precious, a sense of order. If the universe was terrifying, at least it was not silent. Better to live in fear of messages than to live in a world that was random and cruel. To medieval men and women, chance did not exist. There were only signs. Signs from God, from angels, from spirits, or from the devil himself. And so every rustle in the dark, every sudden silence, every bird's cry or dog's howl became a language of dread, of warning, of hope, whispered to those who were willing or desperate enough to listen.
If there was one presence that shaped medieval superstition more than any other, it was the devil. To the people of that age, the devil was not an abstract idea, not a distant figure hidden in Scripture. He was near. He was waiting. His hand was felt in every misfortune. A baby born weak, a cow that gave sour milk, a roof beam that cracked in the night. Each might be blamed on Satan's endless schemes. And in every village, people whispered of neighbors who had fallen under his influence, who had traded their souls for small, fleeting powers. Priests reminded their congregations constantly. The devil was patient, cunning, and tireless. He watched for any weakness, a careless word, an unguarded thought. Even a moment of laughter at the wrong time could open a door to him. He was the enemy, not only of the church, but of every man, woman, and child who tried to live a decent life. The devil's power was visible, they believed, in temptation. A woman who dressed too brightly, who laughed too loudly, might be whispered about as one touched by his fire. A man who prospered too quickly, who seemed lucky beyond reason, might be suspected of having bargained with him. Misfortune and success alike could both be blamed on his hand, for there was no safety, no neutrality. To live in the medieval world was to live on a battlefield where your soul itself was the prize. At night, the devil was thought to walk abroad, not alone, but with his servants. Witches, bound to him by dark oaths, were said to gather in fields and forests, performing rituals that mocked the holy sacraments. Their spirits, people believed, could leave their bodies and fly through the night, feasting at grotesque banquets presided over by demons. The ordinary man or woman feared these gatherings, but they also feared that a neighbor, a midwife, a solitary widow might secretly be part of them. Suspicion poisoned communities, turning every strange glance, every odd habit into potential proof of the devil's work. And death, the great terror of the age, was his ultimate triumph. On the deathbed, priests urged the dying to confess, to cling to faith, for demons were said to crowd around, ready to snatch the soul away the moment it faltered. The last breath of a person was not only the end of life, but the decisive moment of eternal destiny. Angels and demons, it was believed, struggled over every departing soul. This shadow of the devil lay across all things. He was in the whispers of the forest, in the storms that battered the crops, in the fever that stole children from their mother's arms. He was a presence that made the world feel dangerous, precarious, filled with traps. And yet, paradoxically, his existence gave meaning to suffering. Misfortune was not meaningless. It was a reminder of the cosmic battle that touched even the smallest village. To live under the devil's shadow was to live with fear, but also with certainty. The devil explained the inexplicable. He gave a face to chaos. And though he terrified, he also made the world feel, in some strange and terrible way, ordered. If the medieval world was filled with spirits, demons, and omens, then men and women needed armor, not the steel of knights, but the quiet defenses of talismans and charms. These objects were small, often humble, but to those who carried them, they were shields against the unseen. A peasant leaving home at dawn might tuck a charm into his pouch, a token against misfortune. A mother might stitch a protective symbol into her child's clothing, invisible to the eye, but powerful enough, she hoped, to keep illness away. These items were rarely grand or costly. Often they were scraps, a bit of bone, a smooth stone, a piece of iron bent into a shape, a thread of red wool tied around the wrist. What mattered was not the object itself, but the belief that it carried force. Force to ward off spirits, to repel curses, to deflect the devil's gaze. The cross, of course, was the most common and trusted of all protections. Even the poorest villager might wear a small wooden one, carved crudely but treasured. To make the sign of the cross upon waking, before eating, before stepping into the dark, was to cloak oneself in a shield of holy power. Churches distributed bits of consecrated wax, blessed palms from Easter, or holy water in tiny vials, each carried home and guarded like treasure, each believed to form a barrier against the lurking, invisible world. But religion was only part of it. The old folk practices, older than Christianity, lingered and mingled with the new faith. Iron, for example, was thought to repel evil spirits. Farmers hung iron horseshoes above their doors not as decoration, but as armor. Knives were sometimes slipped beneath pillows, not for defense against thieves, but against nightmares. Keys, too, held power, symbol of control, symbol of safety, and were carried as quiet talismans by many. Children were thought to be especially vulnerable, small and unbaptized souls easy prey for spirits. Mothers tied amulets around their necks, teeth of wolves, bits of coral, small crosses of lead. In some places, garlic bulbs were hung above a cradle, the pungent smell thought to drive away demons of the night. A baby's first hair was carefully kept, sometimes braided into a charm, to protect the child as it grew. Travelers, exposed to every danger of road and forest, carried their own charms. Pilgrims pinned badges from holy sites onto their cloaks, proof that they had walked the sacred paths and that the saints themselves watched over them. Others carried small bags filled with herbs, rosemary, sage, rue, believed to shield against witches and spirits. Merchants often kept coins marked with strange symbols, a secret guarantee that fortune would favor their journeys and their trade. To the modern eye, these may seem like trinkets, meaningless scraps, but to those who lived in a world shadowed by demons and ruled by omens, these objects were lifelines. Each charm, each amulet, each scrap of iron or bone was a whisper of hope, a promise of safety. Without them, one was naked before the terrors of the unseen. With them, life felt just a little less fragile, a little less haunted.
If charms of wood and iron were not enough, the medieval imagination turned to stranger things. Objects taken from the natural world, plants, stones, even the remains of animals and humans were thought to hold hidden powers. These were not just tokens, but ingredients, woven into amulets and potions, carried as protections against the terrors of the invisible. Bones were among the most powerful of these. A wolf's tooth, hung on a cord, was set to guard its wearer against sudden attack, the fierce spirit of the animal lending its strength. A bird's claw protected travelers from getting lost, ensuring that their path always returned them home. The bones of saints, of course, were in a category of their own, relics, housed in churches and monasteries, sometimes carried in miniature reliquaries by the wealthy. But even the bones of ordinary animals, worn close to the skin, were believed to form a barrier between the living and the restless dead. Hair and nails, too, were thought to contain the essence of life. To carry a lock of someone's hair was to hold a piece of their soul, a dangerous power in the wrong hands. Lovers exchanged them as tokens, but mothers also saved a child's first hair to weave into protective charms. In darker corners of belief, these same things could be stolen by witches and used in curses. For this reason, cut hair and trimmed nails were often buried or burned, never thrown carelessly away. Stones were another treasure of the unseen world. Some believed that quartz, polished smooth, could heal fevers. Amber, warm against the skin, was worn against toothaches. In some villages, a special hag stone, a stone with a natural hole through it, was hung by the door to protect the household from spirits. To peer through such a stone
was said to reveal things hidden, the movements of witches or the shapes of spirits drifting through the night. But it was in plants and herbs that superstition flourished most vividly. Garlic, pungent and sharp, was a favorite shield against the devil's creatures. Rue and sage were burned to purify homes. Wormwood was hung in stables to protect the horses. Nettles tied in bundles kept lightning away. Even ordinary bread could become an amulet if blessed and carried in a pocket. Then there were the stranger, darker ingredients. Dried blood, ground into powder, was sometimes swallowed as a charm against illness. Powdered skulls were sold in apothecaries, taken with wine to heal pain. In some places, the fat of executed criminals was believed to carry miraculous power, used in salves to ward off wounds and disease. The boundary between faith, superstition, and outright horror was very thin. These ingredients, strange as they may seem, reveal something about the medieval mind, the belief that power was hidden everywhere, waiting to be unlocked. Every living thing, every fragment of the natural world carried a spark of the invisible. By wearing it, burning it, swallowing it, or burying it, one could draw on that spark, bending the dangerous unseen world into something just a little safer. And so a medieval traveler might set out with a wolf's tooth around his neck, a stone in his pocket, a sprig of rue in his satchel, and a pinch of dried blood sewn into his clothing. Not because he enjoyed carrying such things, but because to go without them would feel reckless, even suicidal, in a world where spirits pressed close and the devil's hand was never far away.
Where fear exists, there will always be those eager to profit from it. And in the Middle Ages, fear was endless. Disease, famine, war, the devil himself, every danger seemed to demand protection. Into this climate stepped the charlatans, the healers, the cunning men and women who promised safety in exchange for coin. At the bustling markets of medieval towns, one could always find a vendor with a pouch of mysterious powders, or a bundle of herbs said to repel demons. Some sold small vials of water, declaring them drawn from holy springs. Others offered stones fallen from the heavens, guaranteed to keep lightning from striking a home. Many carried letters of supposed authority, boasting that their charms had been blessed by a bishop or even touched to a saint's relic. The truth mattered little. What mattered was the performance, the confidence, the hope kindled in a frightened buyer's eyes. It was not only in towns. In villages, too, there were always one or two figures whispered about for their knowledge. A healer who knew which herbs to boil for fever and which to hang in doorways against witches. A midwife who muttered charms as she delivered children, half prayer, half incantation. A shepherd who claimed to speak words that cured the bite of a snake. These people straddled a line, respected, feared, and sometimes accused. Were they gifted with wisdom, or had they struck a bargain with the devil? The answer often depended on whether their remedies succeeded or whether their neighbors envied them. For many, the church was the ultimate authority, and priests thundered against superstition from their pulpits. Yet even within the church, contradictions flourished. Some clergy quietly blessed charms for frightened parishioners, or sold bits of parchment inscribed with protective psalms. Monasteries housed relics, bones, scraps of cloth, drops of blood that drew pilgrims by the thousands, each pilgrim leaving offerings of money in return for the hope of protection. And though the relics were sometimes genuine, they were just as often fakes, bones of animals passed off as saints,
wood from ordinary trees declared to be pieces of the true cross. The line between healer and fraud was often blurred. A woman mixing herbs in her cottage might truly believe in the powers she invoked. A merchant hawking powdered skull in the market might know it was worthless, but sell it anyway. The buyer, desperate for safety, rarely cared which it was. Belief itself was half the medicine. But there was danger, too. In a world where fear of the devil was constant, those who trafficked too boldly in charms and spells risked suspicion. A healer who succeeded too often might be praised as wise, or accused as a witch. A merchant caught selling false relics could be publicly punished, his wares burned as blasphemy. And yet, for all the risks, the trade in superstition never waned. There was always another fearful soul ready to pay. Charlatans thrived because the world was so uncertain. Crops failed, storms struck, children died, and people longed for any scrap of control. To hold an amulet, to swallow a potion, to pay a healer, it gave the illusion of safety, and sometimes that illusion was enough. And so medieval life unfolded in a haze of bought protections, charms sold in marketplaces, powders from distant lands, relics kissed and prayed over. In every coin spent was a small act of defiance against the darkness, a desperate hope that the unseen world could be bargained with, or at least delayed.
If amulets and charms were the armor of the body, prayers and incantations were the armor of the soul. In the medieval world, words themselves carried power, spoken aloud, whispered in the dark, written on scraps of parchment and folded into clothing. The line between a prayer and a spell was often thin, sometimes invisible. Every journey, no matter how short, began with words of protection. A farmer stepping into his fields might murmur the Lord's Prayer before crossing the threshold, tracing a cross in the dirt with his staff. A merchant on the road might recite a psalm as he mounted his horse, believing that each word formed a barrier between him and whatever prowled along the forest paths. Soldiers muttered invocations before battle, asking for the intercession of saints to turn aside arrows and steel. But not all words came from Scripture. Folk incantations were whispered, passed down in families, half remembered and half feared. A mother might recite a rhyme over her child's cradle to keep nightmares away. A shepherd might chant a short verse while sprinkling salt around his flock to keep wolves and spirits at bay. Some of these verses invoked the Virgin Mary, others the names of saints. Still others called on forces much older, names and fragments from pagan traditions that lingered in memory long after the Church condemned them. Written prayers were especially prized. A slip of parchment bearing a psalm or a Latin charm was believed to hold miraculous strength. Pilgrims bought them by the thousands, small scrolls inscribed with protection against demons or against sudden death. Worn in a pouch around the neck, tucked into boots or sewn into garments, these words became invisible shields. Even those who could not read believed in the power of holy writing. The letters themselves, sacred and mysterious, were thought to frighten evil away. In times of sickness or fear, people turned to words as their first and last defense. When plague swept through a town, prayers were chanted in unbroken chains hour after hour, day after day. Families whispered charms as they buried their dead, desperate to keep the sickness from claiming another. In the dead of night, when storms battered the village, entire households knelt together, chanting psalms in trembling voices, each syllable a plea that the roof would hold, that lightning would pass them by. For the medieval mind, words were never empty. They were weapons. To speak them was to shape reality, to push back against the chaos of a world filled with shadows. To pray was not merely to hope, it was to fight. And so every man and woman carried an armory of words within them. Some were prayers taught by priests, others were rhymes whispered by grandmothers, others still were fragments of chants too old to trace. Together, they formed an invisible shield that was never put aside. For in a haunted world, one was never truly safe without words to guard the soul.
If prayers and incantations guarded the soul, then the home itself had to be fortified against the unseen. The medieval house was not only a shelter of wood and stone, but a battlefield where invisible enemies might slip through the cracks. Families lived with the constant awareness that spirits, witches, and demons could enter uninvited, and so they armed their doorways, windows, and hearths with rituals meant to keep the darkness at bay. The threshold of the home was the first line of defense. Salt, precious and pure, was scattered across doorways to form a barrier that spirits could not cross. A pinch was sometimes thrown into the fire when guests entered, ensuring that no evil clung to them as they stepped inside. Iron, too, was a trusted guard, horseshoes nailed above the door, knives hidden beneath the lintel, keys hung in plain sight. These objects, common and simple, were thought to repel demons and keep witches from crossing the threshold. Above the hearth, bundles of herbs dangled from beams, their scent filling the air. Rue, sage, rosemary, and garlic were favored, each with its own power. Rue banished witches, sage cleansed sickness, rosemary guarded against the wandering dead, garlic repelled the devil himself. These bundles were renewed each season, tied with colored thread, and burned when their strength was thought to fade. The smoke rose through the house like a shield, sealing the walls with unseen power. Fire itself was a sacred ally. Candles blessed at Candlemas or Easter were treasured as weapons against storms and spirits. When lightning split the sky, families lit these candles, believing their holy flame would drive away danger. In some places, the hearth fire was never allowed to die completely, for an unlit house was vulnerable, an open door for things that crept in the dark. A new fire was not struck with flint, but borrowed from a neighbor or from the church, passed carefully from hand to hand as though it carried life itself. At times of particular fear, after a death in the household or when illness stalked the village, families drew circles around their homes. Ashes, chalk, or even urine might be poured around the walls, marking a sacred boundary that no spirit could cross. Inside this circle, prayers were whispered, candles burned, and herbs smoldered in the fire. For a night or a week, the family lived enclosed in a fragile fortress, hoping the barrier would hold. Children, thought to be the most vulnerable, were given extra protection. Charms were tied above their cradles, small crosses carved into the wood, sprigs of herbs hung just within reach of the breeze. Mothers sang lullabies that were not only songs but incantations, weaving protective words into the rhythm of sleep. Even toys were sometimes marked with signs or symbols to guard against the spirits that preyed on the young. To the medieval mind, a house was never merely a place to eat and sleep. It was a fortress of fragile walls, surrounded by a storm of unseen dangers. Every doorway, every beam, every stone was strengthened with rituals, small acts repeated with faith and desperation. These domestic protections may seem quaint or foolish now, but in their time, they were as essential as bread or water. Without them, home was not safety, it was exposure.
Though individuals armed themselves with charms and whispered prayers, the struggle against the unseen world was never faced alone. In the Middle Ages, danger was shared, and so too were the protections. Communities gathered in rituals that blurred the line between religion, superstition, and desperate hope, creating defenses larger than any single household could muster.
When plague swept through a village, bells tolled not just to mark the dead, but to drive away the spirits believed to carry disease. Entire populations poured into the streets, carrying relics, banners of saints, and burning candles. They processed slowly through fields and along the edges of towns, chanting psalms and hymns to build a wall of sound and prayer. To the villagers, this was not ceremony alone. It was war, a direct assault on the spirits of sickness that prowled among them. Exorcisms, too, became public affairs. When someone was thought to be possessed, it was not a private struggle, but a village drama. The afflicted would be brought to the church, surrounded by priests, family, and neighbors. Candles were lit, bells rung, prayers shouted into the heavy air. The entire community lent its voice not only to drive out the demon, but to remind one another that they were not helpless, that together they could resist the devil's intrusion. There were rituals meant to protect entire harvests as well. In some regions, priests walked the boundaries of farmland, sprinkling holy water on the soil, invoking saints to keep storms and pests away. Villagers joined in, carrying torches or herbs, creating circles of protection around the fields that meant survival for the coming year. These rituals carried both practical unity and deep comfort. No family stood alone against the invisible forces that threatened their food and their future. At times of extraordinary fear, when eclipses darkened the sky, when comets blazed overhead, when rumors of witchcraft spread, villages staged night-long vigils. Fires were lit in the central square, children kept awake, the old and young chanting prayers until dawn. The sense of terror was real, but so too was the sense of belonging. In the glow of the flames, with voices rising together, the people felt less fragile, less exposed. The church sanctioned some of these rituals, guiding processions and blessing the torches and relics. Others emerged from older, half-forgotten traditions. Circles danced in fields, bonfires leaping high, charms buried at crossroads. Even when the church frowned, the people continued, for fear demanded action. Community rituals transformed superstition from a private burden into a collective shield. Alone, a man with a charm felt weak. Together, hundreds of voices and candles, the entire village became a fortress. Fear was shared, but so was strength. And so, in the rhythm of medieval life, these gatherings became milestones of both faith and survival. They were not only defenses against spirits and demons, but affirmations that no one lived or feared alone.
To fall sick in the Middle Ages was never just to fall sick. Illness was rarely seen as a simple accident of the body, a misfortune of flesh and blood. Instead, it was interpreted as a punishment, a curse, a sign that invisible forces had turned against you. Disease was a language, and every cough, every sore, every fever was thought to speak of sins, malice, or spirits at work. The explanation for sickness began always with sin. A fever was not merely heat in the blood, but the fire of God's anger made visible in the body. A withered limb might be a punishment for pride. A child born sickly might be the burden of the parents' unconfessed wrongs. The church taught that suffering was the earthly mark of spiritual corruption, a chance to atone, a foretaste of hell that could be turned to salvation if borne with patience and prayer. But this moral reading of disease was only one part of the picture. Among villagers and townsfolk, more sinister causes were often suspected. If a man who had been healthy yesterday was struck down by sudden illness today, perhaps it was not God at all, but a witch. Witches were believed to carry poisons, powders, and whispered words that could shrivel crops and sicken neighbors. A bitter glance at the marketplace, a muttered curse at the well, could be enough to send someone to bed with a wasting fever. Accusations spread quickly. In times of sickness, suspicion turned toward widows, healers, or anyone who lived at the margins of the community. And there were other culprits. The devil himself was thought to delight in disease. A plague was not merely a pestilence, but an army of demons, sent to test or to torment. The air itself was believed to carry their corruption, foul miasms rising from swamps, stinking vapors creeping from graveyards, unseen hands clutching at lungs and throats. A bad smell was more than unpleasant, it was dangerous, a warning that spirits of disease were near. People carried herbs, bloodletting sauce, or even perfumed pomanders, believing the fragrance would drive away the demons that swarmed in foul air. When the Black Death came in the mid-14th century, these fears became unbearable. To watch neighbors collapse in the streets, to see whole families dead within days, was to feel the hand of the devil pressing directly upon the world. Chroniclers wrote of demons marching invisibly through towns, cutting people down with unseen scythes. Others believed the plague was loosed by God as punishment for humanity's sins. In either case, there was no cure in the eyes of the people, only repentance, ritual, and desperate attempts to appease the unseen powers that had unleashed such horror. But it was not only great plagues. Even small illnesses carried supernatural weight. The sweating sickness of England, sudden and deadly, was interpreted as a curse that struck the proud. Leprosy, with its slow wasting of flesh, was seen as both punishment and mark of sin. Lepers were cast out of villages, forced to live apart, ringing bells to warn others of their approach, as if their very presence carried the devil's breath. Epilepsy, little understood, was called the falling sickness and believed to be possession by demons. The sight of a body convulsing uncontrollably filled onlookers with dread, proof that the invisible battle between good and evil could erupt at any moment in the flesh of the innocent. Even animals were not spared. A cow that sickened might be thought bewitched or struck by the envy of a neighbor. Whole herds lost to disease were blamed on the devil's wrath or the malice of witches who spoiled the milk. A farmer who lost his oxen might dig up his field in search of cursed objects buried in the soil, strange bundles of hair, bone, and thread placed there, it was believed, by those who wished him harm. Healing, when attempted, was often entangled with these beliefs. To treat a fever was not only to cool the body, but to cool the spirit, to pray away the sin or curse that had caused it. Physicians might prescribe herbs or bloodletting, but peasants and townsfolk alike often trusted more in prayers, charms, and pilgrimages. A trip to the shrine of a saint might succeed where medicine had failed. If the illness was a curse, only the sacred could break it. And yet, despite the fear, disease was not always viewed purely as a horror. For some, it was also an opportunity. To fall sick was to be reminded of mortality, to be forced into repentance. A long illness gave a man time to confess, to prepare for death, to cleanse his soul. In this way, disease was seen as a dark mercy, a reminder that the devil prowled close, but that God's grace could still be grasped before the end. For those who survived, however, illness left scars of suspicion. Who had cursed them? Who had wished them harm? What neighbor's envy, what witch's malice had nearly brought them to the grave? Communities fractured under the weight of these suspicions. Fear of disease was not only fear of the invisible world, but fear of one another. And so, every cough, every fever, every wasting body was more than a medical condition. It was a story, an accusation, a battle. In the medieval world, disease was never just a sickness of flesh. It was a curse, a punishment, a visitation from demons, or a sign of God's anger.
In the haunted landscape of the Middle Ages, where every illness was a curse and every fever a punishment, there was always a desperate search for someone, anyone, who might know how to fight back. These were the healers, the cunning folk, the women and men who carried within them the knowledge of herbs, charms, and rituals. They were at once respected, feared, and suspected, for their wisdom bordered too closely on the dangerous line between the holy and the forbidden. Imagine a small village at the edge of a forest. A child burns with fever. The priest has come, sprinkled holy water, recited psalms, and urged the family to pray. But the fever rages still. The mother, trembling with desperation, turns not to the church, but to the cottage of the old woman who lives at the far end of the lane. This woman has seen many winters, her hands lined with work, her shelves crowded with bundles of dried herbs. She mixes a potion of willow bark, sage, and honey, murmuring words half prayer and half charm as she stirs. The child swallows. The fever breaks, and by morning the boy is sitting up again. To the family, this is salvation. To the neighbors, it is proof of mysterious power. And in the minds of many, such power could not be entirely innocent. These healers were woven into the very fabric of medieval life. They were the midwives, delivering children into a dangerous world, their skills sometimes the only barrier between life and death. They were the herbalists, who knew which roots could ease a cough and which leaves could draw poison from a wound. They were the bone setters, the charm sayers, the wise ones who seemed to carry secrets that no priest or physician could provide. Yet with every act of healing came suspicion. If a woman could bring health with a potion, might she not also bring sickness with another? If a man's words could soothe a nightmare, might they not also summon one? The very same knowledge that brought comfort was also feared as a gateway to the devil's art. Physicians, trained in universities and armed with Latin texts, looked down upon these rustic practitioners, but their remedies, bloodletting, purges, and elaborate mixtures of exotic ingredients were expensive and often ineffective. For most villagers, a university physician was an impossible luxury. The healer at the edge of the field with her herbs and her whispered charms was far more accessible. And though she might never call herself a witch, the line between healer and sorceress was fragile, easily crossed in the minds of her neighbors. Take, for example, the use of herbs. Some plants were widely accepted: sage for digestion, mint for the stomach, lavender for calm. But others carried darker reputations. Mandrake root, shaped like a tiny human body, was said to scream when pulled from the ground, killing the one who uprooted it unless elaborate rituals were performed. Belladonna, with its dark, glossy berries, could both soothe pain and induce visions. Henbane and hemlock were used in small doses for ailments, but in larger amounts could kill. Those who knew how to use such plants wisely were either revered as saviors or feared as witches dabbling with poison. Then there were charms, the muttered words spoken over wounds or whispered into cups of water. Some invoked saints and Christ's name, making them appear to be extensions of the Church's protection. Others, however, drew upon older traditions, calling upon the elements, the moon, or nameless forces. To some, these were harmless remnants of pagan pasts. To others, they were the very proof of the devil's art. The healers themselves often lived precarious lives. Their services were sought in times of need, but once the crisis passed, gratitude could turn to unease. A midwife who saved a mother in childbirth might be praised as a miracle worker, until a later child died in her care, and whispers of witchcraft began. A healer whose herbs cured fevers might be thanked by grateful families, but if the harvest failed or cattle sickened, the same healer might suddenly be blamed. Stories of witches grew out of this fragile balance. In the imagination of the people, witches were those who twisted healing knowledge into harm. Women who brewed potions not to cure but to kill, who stole milk from cows with a glance, who spoiled marriages with whispered curses, who gathered at night in wild Sabbaths with demons. These tales spread with every misfortune,
And soon anyone who possessed unusual skill or who lived too far outside the patterns of village life risked suspicion. Yet it is important to remember that for most medieval people, healers were not villains but lifelines. When a child coughed blood, when a wound festered, when nightmares tormented a household, it was to the healer that people turned. They paid not only in coins but in food, labor, and loyalty. These women and men carried a store of knowledge passed down through generations. Recipes for poultices, techniques for easing childbirth, ways of using smoke and fire to cleanse the air. Without them, survival would have been far more fragile. The Church walked a delicate path. On one hand, it condemned superstition, warning against charms and incantations. On the other, it recognized the need for healing and even sanctioned certain practices, provided they were framed in Christian terms. A healer who invoked the Virgin Mary was tolerated. One who invoked nameless spirits was feared. The difference was subtle, but it could mean the line between protection and persecution. By the late Middle Ages, suspicion grew sharper. Witch trials became more frequent, and the figure of the healer, once indispensable, was increasingly recast as dangerous. But in the centuries before the great witch hunts, these figures occupied a gray space, necessary, respected, feared, and vulnerable. For the medieval villager, the healer was a paradox. She might be the one who saved your child's life. She might also be the one accused of cursing your neighbor's cow. She stood at the crossroads of faith and fear, her every act both salvation and potential sin. In a world where disease was a curse and medicine a fragile art, these healers carried the burden of hope and the shadow of suspicion. They were in many ways the human face of medieval superstition, living proof that knowledge itself could be both a blessing and a danger, a gift from God or a temptation from the devil, depending on who told the story.
If herbs, charms, and whispered words belong to the world of healers and so-called witches, then the greatest medicine of the Middle Ages was not found in fields or forests at all, but in the hands of the Church. For in a world where sickness was seen as punishment and demons lurked in every shadow, the most powerful cure was believed to be faith itself. The medieval mind turned instinctively toward the sacred when confronted with illness. A fever could be soothed with herbs, yes, but it was also eased by a priest's blessing. A wound might be washed with wine, but it was also touched with holy water. The physical was never separated from the spiritual. Healing was not only a matter of treating the body, it was a struggle for the soul. Relics above all held a place of honor. The bones of saints, fragments of clothing, drops of blood preserved in reliquaries of gold and crystal. These were believed to radiate divine power. Pilgrims traveled vast distances to touch or even glimpse them, seeking cures for sicknesses that seemed beyond human help. To stand before the shrine of Saint Roch, protector against plague, or Saint Apollonia, invoked for toothaches, was to believe oneself within reach of miraculous healing. Chroniclers tell of the sick rising from beds of straw after touching the reliquary of a saint, of blind eyes opened, of fevers broken in a single night. Whether or not these were true cures mattered less than the hope they inspired, hope that sustained both the sick and the healthy alike. Pilgrimages were not only journeys of devotion, but acts of medical desperation. A mother carrying a child weak with consumption might set out on a journey of weeks, sleeping by the roadside, begging for bread, enduring rain and cold simply to reach a holy spring or a saint's tomb. At Canterbury, pilgrims pressed so closely to the shrine of Thomas Becket that guards were forced to hold them back.
each desperate for a drop of water mixed with the saint's blood, believed to heal wounds and fevers alike. In Spain, at Santiago de Compostela, travelers limped for miles on broken feet, convinced that the journey itself, through suffering and prayer, would draw down heaven's mercy. Faith was woven into daily healing as well. A charm was strongest if it was blessed by a priest, an herb gained power if it was gathered on the feast of a saint. Even the most humble remedies were often accompanied by a whispered prayer. Mothers drew crosses on their foreheads with saliva, believing the sacred mark would guard them from fever. Farmers blessed their animals with holy water to prevent disease from sweeping through the herds. Every act of healing was doubled, physical and spiritual, each reinforcing the other. Holy water, blessed salt, consecrated candles, all these were distributed by the church as weapons against illness and the devil's power. To sprinkle holy water in a sick room was to drive out demons. To place blessed salt on the tongue of the ill was to cleanse both body and spirit. A candle blessed at Candlemas, lit beside the bed of the dying, was thought to keep demons at bay in the final hours, ensuring the soul's safe passage. Confession, too, was a kind of healing. To confess sins before a priest was to unburden the soul, and many believed that such absolution could bring relief to the body as well. Illness, after all, was often read as the mark of sin. If the sin was forgiven, might not the illness fade? In some accounts, penitents left the confessional not only spiritually cleansed, but physically stronger, as though their fever had been lifted along with their guilt. Yet faith was not only a balm for the sick, it was also a protection for the healthy. To wear a pilgrim's badge was to carry a piece of the saint's power home. To drink from a sacred spring was not only to cure, but to guard against future sickness. Families hung small reliquaries in their homes, tiny boxes of silver or lead containing fragments of cloth or earth, each a shield against invisible dangers. The great plagues of Europe brought these practices into sharp relief. As death swept through towns, people turned to processions, carrying relics through the streets, chanting prayers in endless rhythm. In some places, groups of flagellants marched from city to city, whipping themselves bloody, in the belief that their suffering would appease God's anger and turn aside the pestilence. These desperate acts were not medicine as we know it, but they were medicine of the spirit. Ways to make sense of overwhelming terror and to believe, even for a moment, that one was not helpless. And indeed, there was healing in such faith, not always in the body, but in the heart. A man who believed that a saint watched over him bore his illness with courage. A woman who drank from a sacred spring could face her fever with hope rather than despair. Hope itself was a powerful medicine, easing suffering, giving strength where none should remain. The church understood this well. Monasteries became centers of healing, not only with herbs and baths, but with relics, prayers, and sacred rituals. Hospitals were founded not to cure in the modern sense, but to provide a place where the sick could be tended, confessed, and prepared for either recovery or death under the gaze of God. To heal the soul was as important as to heal the body, and often the two were believed inseparable. Faith gave structure to suffering. It explained why illness struck, why some lived and others died. It gave purpose to pain and promised that even if the body failed, the soul might yet triumph. In this way, faith was not only a cure, but a shield, allowing medieval men and women to endure the constant presence of sickness without despair. And so, in the flickering light of candles, before relics housed in jeweled shrines, in whispered prayers at bedsides, the medieval world turned again and again to faith as its truest medicine. Herbs might ease, charms might protect, but only faith could promise that illness was not meaningless, that even in suffering, one's place in the great battle between God and the devil was secure.
When we think of the Renaissance, we often imagine a world transformed. Gleaming cities of art and science, men in fine robes studying the stars, Leonardo da Vinci sketching machines of flight, Copernicus daring to move the Earth from the center of the cosmos. It is tempting to see this period as a sudden break from the darkness of the Middle Ages, a dawning of reason and the slow fading of superstition. But the truth is far more complex. The Renaissance was not the death of superstition. It was its rebirth in new forms. Old beliefs lingered stubbornly, reshaped and reimagined, carried into the courts of kings and the studies of scholars. Even as men painted frescoes of angels with mathematical precision, they still carried amulets in their pockets. Even as astronomers charted the heavens, they still read the stars for omens. The Renaissance was a time of contradiction, where superstition and science walked hand in hand. Take astrology. In the medieval world, the movement of the heavens had already been read as signs, eclipses as portents of doom, comets as heralds of war. In the Renaissance, astrology did not fade, it flourished. Learned men cast elaborate horoscopes, not only for peasants but for kings. Rulers would not marry, go to war, or even set out on a journey without consulting the stars. Catherine de' Medici in France kept astrologers at her court, their charts and calculations guiding matters of state. Physicians, too, consulted the heavens before bleeding a patient or prescribing herbs, believing the position of Mars or Saturn could determine the outcome of an illness. The cosmos was not merely studied, it was still believed to speak. Alchemy offers another glimpse of this strange blend. We imagine alchemy as the clumsy forerunner of chemistry, men in dark rooms striving to turn lead into gold. And in part it was, but it was also steeped in superstition. Alchemists were spurred of secret symbols, of formulas half hidden in ancient texts, of divine truths encoded in metals and stones. Their laboratories were chapels as much as workshops, their work not merely practical, but spiritual. They sought not only to transform metals, but to transform themselves, to reach purity and enlightenment. For the Renaissance alchemist, science and magic were not enemies, but allies, threads of the same tapestry. In villages, the old superstitions remained as stubborn as weeds. Farmers still buried charms in their fields to guard against blight. Mothers still tied herbs above their children's beds. Witches were still feared, perhaps more than ever, for the Renaissance was also the age of the great witch hunts. Ironically, at the very moment when scholars claimed to rediscover reason, thousands of women and men were accused, tortured, and burned for practicing the very superstitions that had been part of village life for centuries. The fear of the devil's agents grew sharper, more organized, fueled by new manuals of demonology written not by peasants, but by university-trained theologians. The courts of nobles shimmered with luxury, but even there superstition thrived. Amulets of precious stones were worn not only for beauty but for protection. Rubies were thought to guard against plague, emeralds against poison. Gold, when powdered and swallowed, was believed to strengthen the heart. Monarchs carried relics into battle, convinced that the bones of saints would turn aside enemies' swords. In England, Henry VIII wore a jewel said to cure epilepsy. In the Holy Roman Empire, emperors were anointed with oils believed to grant divine protection. Beneath the glitter of Renaissance splendor lay the same old fears, dressed now in velvet and jewels. The printing press, that great engine of change, spread superstition as eagerly as it spread knowledge. Pamphlets describing omens, prodigies, and wonders circulated widely. Tales of monstrous births, of showers of blood, of animals speaking with human voices flew across Europe in cheap print, read by peasants and princes alike. Each strange event was interpreted as a message, a warning of divine wrath or the devil's mischief. Far from fading, the appetite for signs and wonders only grew with the spread of literacy. Medicine, too, remained deeply entangled with superstition. While Renaissance physicians studied anatomy and dissected bodies with new precision, they still prescribed charms alongside herbs. They still advised patients to carry written prayers, to wear certain stones, to recite incantations at dawn. A learned doctor might study Galen and Hippocrates by day, then slip a talisman under his pillow at night. The boundary between science and superstition was porous, and many walked freely across it. Even among the greatest minds, belief in the invisible world remained strong. Paracelsus, the revolutionary physician and alchemist, rejected much of classical medicine, but he also wrote of elemental spirits, gnomes in the earth, undines in the water, sylphs in the air, salamanders in fire. To him, these were not fantasies, but truths, woven into the structure of the world. For every rational discovery, there seemed to be a mystical counterpart, each feeding the other. Why did superstition endure so powerfully in the Renaissance? Perhaps because the world was still dangerous, still uncertain. Plague had not disappeared. War still ravaged towns. Infants still died in their cradles. Women still perished in childbirth. Crops still failed. Science offered new tools, yes, but it did not banish fear. Superstition, with its charms and rituals, offered a sense of control that no new learning could fully replace. And so the Renaissance was not the end of medieval superstition, but its transformation. It climbed from the villages into the palaces, from the hearth into the laboratory. It wrapped itself in the language of science, in the elegance of art, in the authority of print. And in this form it endured, a reminder that even in an age of brilliance, the human heart still trembled before the shadows of the unseen.
The medieval world, with its demons, omens, and charms, may seem impossibly distant from our own. We imagine ourselves as rational creatures, heirs of science and reason, free from the terrors that haunted the minds of peasants beneath thatched roofs or nobles in candlelit halls. And yet, the echoes of those fears are all around us still. Superstition did not vanish with the coming of modernity. It lingered, reshaped, softened, but still present in the corners of our lives. Think, for example, of the simple act of knocking on wood. Today, it is a casual gesture, a way of warding off bad luck after a bold statement. But its roots reach back into the same soil of fear and belief that nourished the Middle Ages. To medieval minds, trees were living beings, filled with spirits, their wood infused with power. To touch wood was to touch protection, to draw on the strength of nature against misfortune. We no longer speak of the spirits in the bark, but the gesture remains, a fossil of an older faith. Or consider the black cat. To us, it is a creature of mystery, sometimes a symbol of Halloween, sometimes an ordinary pet met with suspicion on the street. But in medieval villages, a black cat was a dangerous omen, an animal believed to serve witches, to carry the devil's essence in its sleek fur and shining eyes. To see one cross your path was to fear that harm would soon follow. Even now, in the 21st century, some refuse to walk ahead if a black cat darts across the road, preferring instead to pause or take another path, as though the weight of centuries still presses on that moment. The number 13 carries similar weight. In the medieval mind, numbers were not neutral. They were symbols, carriers of divine or demonic force. 12 was a number of perfection. 12 apostles, 12 months, 12 signs of the zodiac. 13 was the number that disrupted harmony, a sign of imbalance and misfortune. At the Last Supper, Judas made the 13th at the table, and so 13 became a mark of ill omen. To this day, buildings skip the 13th floor, hotels avoid numbering rooms with 13, and Friday the 13th is greeted with unease. What was once a medieval dread has become a superstition so embedded in modern culture that it shapes the architecture of our cities. Spilled salt is another survival.
To us, knocking over the salt cellar at dinner may be clumsy, but it still prompts the reflex to toss a pinch over the shoulder. In the Middle Ages, salt was not only precious, but sacred, a symbol of purity and protection. To spill it was to waste something holy, to invite evil into the home. The gesture of throwing it over the left shoulder was meant to blind the devil, who was believed to lurk at that side. We no longer speak of his presence, but the movement remains, carried out in kitchens and dining rooms across the world. The idea of the evil eye also stretches from medieval superstition into modern life. The belief that envy itself could wound, that a jealous glance could bring sickness or misfortune, was deeply ingrained in medieval Europe, as it is still in parts of the Mediterranean and Middle East. Mothers hung charms to protect their children from it. Farmers painted eyes on barns to turn back the curse. Today, the blue glass eye amulet is still sold in markets, pinned to clothes, hung above doorways. We might call it tradition, but at its core, it is the same fear, the same desperate shield against invisible harm. Even our holidays carry traces of superstition. Halloween, now a celebration of costumes and sweets, grew from medieval All Hallows' Eve, the night when spirits were believed to roam most freely, when the veil between worlds was thinnest. Jack-o'-lanterns, carved from turnips before pumpkins, were set out to frighten away wandering souls. Bonfires lit the darkness not only for warmth, but as a defense against what lingered in the night. The modern festival still carries the shape of those fears, softened into play, but born from dread. Weddings, too, are filled with echoes. The tradition of carrying a bride across the threshold recalls the medieval fear that spirits might cling to her as she entered a new home. To lift her was to break the connection, to deny evil a chance to follow. The veil, now a symbol of beauty, once served as a shield against the envious glance of spirits and men alike. Even the scattering of rice, or its modern substitutes, grew from the belief that noise and abundance could drive away misfortune, ensuring fertility and happiness. We find similar survivals in funeral customs. To cover mirrors, to stop clocks, to wear black, all trace back to medieval practices meant to confuse or repel spirits of the dead. A corpse was not only a body, but a threshold, a moment when the soul's departure might invite other, unwanted presences. To protect the living, rituals wrapped grief in layers of precaution. Many of those gestures still linger, their original meaning forgotten, but their shadow intact. Perhaps the most telling survival of whole is the simple habit of crossing oneself. For many today, it is a mark of faith, but its use as a charm is ancient. In the medieval world, people crossed themselves at every moment of fear, when lightning struck, when they passed a graveyard, when a shadow seemed too long. It was an instinctive shield, a way of making the body itself into a prayer. Even now, in moments of terror or relief, the gesture emerges, as though the body remembers what the mind has forgotten. Why do these survivals endure? Perhaps because the fears that birthed them never truly left us. We may no longer speak of demons in the rafters, but we still fear what we cannot control: illness, misfortune, death. Superstition offers small acts of power, ways to act when we are helpless. To knock on wood, to avoid the unlucky number, to toss salt. It costs nothing, but it gives a fragile comfort. It is in essence the same comfort sought by peasants who hung herbs above their doors or nobles who wore jewels against poison. And so, the medieval world is not gone. It lingers in our gestures, our customs, our unspoken fears. Each superstition we practice today is a thread that ties us back to the haunted villages of the past, to the dark nights when peasants huddled by their hearths, whispering prayers and clutching charms. The demons may have faded, but their shadows remain, cast across centuries, waiting quietly
in the habits we cannot seem to abandon.
Close your eyes for a moment and imagine yourself walking through a medieval village at night. The air is cool, heavy with the scent of wood smoke. The houses are dark, their windows shuttered, their doors bolted against the unseen. Above, the stars shine in vast silence, brighter than any modern city would ever allow. And yet in that silence, you feel the presence of 1,000 fears. Every creak of timber, every whisper of wind carries weight. You are never truly alone. This was the world our ancestors inhabited. A world of shadows and whispers, of signs and omens, of fragile lives balanced on the edge of hunger and sickness. And because so much lay beyond their control, they filled the void with meaning. A falling star was not chance, but a message. A cough was not only illness, but punishment. A shadow at the window was not merely a trick of the light, but a spirit, waiting, watching. We may smile at these beliefs, safe in our own age of science and medicine. We have explanations now, microscopes to reveal the germs that cause fevers, telescopes to chart the true movement of stars. We no longer scatter herbs at doorways, nor light blessed candles to ward off storms. And yet, have we really left all of it behind? Think of the little rituals that still cling to us. Knocking on wood, avoiding the number 13, tossing salt over the shoulder, whispering a prayer before a long journey, carrying a charm for luck before an exam or a game or a moment of fear. These are not so different from the habits of peasants and nobles centuries ago. The names have changed, the meanings blurred, but the longing is the same. It is the longing for control, for reassurance, for a sense that in a chaotic and unpredictable world, we are not entirely powerless. Superstition at its heart was not foolishness, it was comfort. It was a way to weave meaning into suffering, to find a pattern in the chaos. A mother tying herbs above her child's cradle was not simply naive. She was expressing the most human of all desires, to protect what she loved against dangers she could not see. A farmer burying a charm in his field was not ignorant. He was reaching for hope, for a promise that the harvest would not fail. A nobleman clutching a relic at his bedside was not deluded. He was seeking courage in the face of death. And so, when we look back at these medieval superstitions, it is easy to dismiss them as strange, even absurd. But if we look closer, with gentler eyes, we see ourselves reflected there. Our fears are the same, though the language has changed. We fear sickness, misfortune, loneliness, loss. We still turn to rituals, gestures, tokens of luck. We still whisper words into the silence, hoping that somehow they will matter. Superstition is at its heart the echo of our humanity. It binds us across time to the peasants who scattered salt, to the nobles who clutched relics, to the healers who whispered charms. It reminds us that beneath the layers of progress, the heart is still the same, fragile, fearful, yearning for meaning. And so when we look back at these medieval superstitions, it is easy to dismiss them as strange, even absurd. But if we look closer, with gentler eyes, we see ourselves reflected there. Our fears are the same, though the language has changed. We fear sickness, misfortune, loneliness, loss. We still turn to rituals, gestures, tokens of luck. We still whisper words into the silence, hoping that somehow they will matter. The medieval world teaches us something profound, that to be human is to live with uncertainty. We cannot know what tomorrow brings. We cannot control every shadow, every storm. And so we invent stories. We carry charms. We speak prayers. We seek patterns in the stars, in the flight of birds, in the flicker of firelight. It is not weakness. It is survival. It is the mind's way of enduring what the heart cannot bear alone. Picture again that village, dark beneath the stars. A family gathers in a small room, the fire crackling low. The father whispers a prayer before sleep. The mother checks the herbs above the door. The children cross themselves, clutching small wooden charms. Outside, the wind moans through the trees, carrying with it the ancient fears of the night. But inside, the family feels a fragile safety, woven from faith, ritual, and love. They close their eyes and drift into uneasy dreams, knowing that whatever the night holds, they have done what they can. Centuries later, we do much the same. We check the locks before bed. We leave a light burning in the hall. We whisper words of comfort to ourselves or to those we love. We tell stories, stories of ghosts, of fate, of unseen powers, not because we truly believe them, but because they remind us that we are not alone in our fear. Superstition is, in the end, the echo of our humanity. It binds us across time to the peasants who scattered salt, to the nobles who clutched relics, to the healers who whispered charms. It reminds us that beneath the layers of progress, the heart is still the same, fragile, fearful, yearning for meaning. And so, as this story draws to a close, let its final note be not of judgment, but of gentleness. Let us look with compassion on those who lived in a world more dangerous, more uncertain than our own, and see in their fears the mirror of our own quiet anxieties. Their charms and rituals, their prayers and omens, were not so different from our small habits of comfort. We are not so far removed from them. Now, as you lie in your own bed, in the safety of your own time, allow the shadows of the medieval night to fade. The demons that haunted them will not trouble you. The charms they clutched have become the quaint gestures of our day, and yet their fears, their hopes, their longing for protection live on in us still. So let the fire burn low. Let the room grow quiet. Let your eyes grow heavy as the voices of the past fall into silence. You are safe. The story is ending. And as sleep comes gently, think of the countless generations who, just like you, once closed their eyes against the dark, whispering their own words of comfort, seeking the same peace you seek now. Rest then. Rest in the knowledge that though centuries separate us, the fears and comforts of humanity have always been the same. The medieval world has faded, but its echoes remain, soft, ancient, and familiar. Let them fade with you into dreams.